Apartheid, a system of institutionalized racial segregation and discrimination, was one of the darkest chapters in South African history. It officially began in 1948 when the National Party, NP, dominated by Afrikaners, descendants of Dutch settlers, won the national elections and introduced a set of laws designed to enforce the separation of races. The roots of apartheid, however, were deeply embedded in South African society long before the NP victory, with racial segregation policies dating back to colonial rule by the British and Dutch. South Africa's complex racial dynamics trace back to European colonization in the mid-17th century when Dutch settlers, followed by British colonizers, began asserting dominance over the indigenous African populations. Over time, white settlers established themselves as the ruling class, controlling land and resources. Early segregation policies, like the 1913 Land Act, which reserved the majority of the land for white ownership, laid the groundwork for apartheid by displacing black South Africans into small, designated reserves. World War II intensified industrialization and urban migration in South Africa, bringing blacks and whites into closer contact, particularly in cities. Fearing that the increasing urbanization of black people could lead to greater competition and conflict, the Afrikaner-dominated National Party capitalized on white fears of losing dominance. The party's victory in 1948 marked the start of formal apartheid, with an ideology built on racial purity, separateness, and white supremacy. Under apartheid, the South African government passed a series of draconian laws that enforced racial segregation across all facets of life. Some of the most infamous laws included Population Registration Act, 1950. This law classified every South African into one of four racial categories: white, black, colored, mixed race, and Indian. This racial classification became the foundation for discriminatory treatment, as individuals were treated differently based on their race. Group Areas Act, 1950. This law segregated South Africa's residential areas by race. Blacks were forcibly removed from urban centers and relocated to designated townships on the periphery of cities, while prime urban real estate was reserved for whites. Bantu Authorities Act, 1951, and the Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act, 1959. These laws established homelands or Bantustans for black South Africans, ostensibly granting them autonomy. However, these homelands were economically destitute and intended to further marginalize the black population by stripping them of South African citizenship, effectively making them foreigners in their own country. Pass laws. Black South Africans were required to carry passbooks at all times, detailing where they could live, work, and travel. Any deviation from the rules resulted in arrests and imprisonment. Separate Amenities Act, 1953. This law created separate public facilities, schools, hospitals, parks, and even benches for different racial groups, with those designated for whites being far superior to those for blacks and other races. Education laws. The apartheid government deliberately underfunded education for black South Africans. The Bantu Education Act, 1953, enforced a racially biased curriculum that aimed to prepare black students only for menial jobs, while universities like Fort Hare were heavily regulated to limit black intellectual growth. Apartheid ensured that South Africa's wealth, particularly in industries like mining, agriculture, and manufacturing, remained in white hands. Black labor was essential to the economy, but black workers were relegated to the lowest-paying, most dangerous jobs. Land ownership was concentrated in the hands of whites, while the majority of black South Africans were confined to underdeveloped homelands or overcrowded townships. The social impacts of apartheid were equally devastating. Families were torn apart as people were forcibly relocated. A culture of violence and repression permeated society, with the state using police brutality, censorship, and imprisonment to suppress dissent. The infamous police massacre at Sharpeville in 1960, where 69 peaceful protesters were killed, exemplified the ruthless lengths to which the apartheid government would go to maintain power. Resistance to apartheid was widespread, both within South Africa and abroad. The African National Congress (ANC), founded in 1912, played a leading role in organizing opposition to apartheid. Under the leadership of figures like Nelson Mandela, the ANC adopted nonviolent resistance strategies, but by the early 1960s, as repression intensified, it turned to armed struggle. Mandela and other leaders of the ANC were arrested and imprisoned for their activism, most notably during the Rivonia trial in 1964, where Mandela was sentenced to life in prison. The international community increasingly condemned apartheid. The United Nations imposed arms embargoes, and countries around the world initiated economic sanctions against South Africa. Cultural and academic boycotts further isolated the apartheid regime. By the 1980s, internal resistance had intensified, with widespread protests, strikes, and international pressure mounting. The apartheid government attempted to implement reforms, but these were seen as insufficient. In 1990, under President F.W. de Klerk, the apartheid regime began to unravel. Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and negotiations for a new, democratic South Africa began. In 1994, South Africa held its first multiracial elections, and Nelson Mandela was elected the country's first black president. Apartheid was formally dismantled, but its legacy of inequality, poverty, and racial tension continues to affect South African society to this day. The apartheid era left an indelible mark on South Africa. While the country has made significant strides towards reconciliation and equality since 1994, the effects of decades of systemic racism and economic disparity remain visible. The struggle against apartheid is remembered as a testament to the resilience and courage of those who fought for justice and human rights.